Hey everybody, it's Kelly. Welcome back to another episode of Ask a Therapist. You've heard of CompHet, Compulsory Heterosexuality, that assumption that we're all born heterosexual and therefore attracted to people of the opposite sex as is prescribed by society. I want to talk to you about compulsory sexuality, an adjacent and maybe more overarching issue in society in general. Compulsory sexuality assumes that we're all born sexual creatures, whatever that means. If I were to divide that into three general categories, I would say that it assumes that we're all born as desiring subjects, that we all take up sexual identities, and that we all engage in sexual activity. Compulsory sexuality assumes that on different levels, in different categories, we are all somewhere in there sexual beings. There's been a request across the channel for more information on asexuality and what that spectrum looks like. And as that has happened, we've also seen this sort of surge in understanding and visibility on certain social media platforms that being somewhere on the ace spectrum is a much more normative experience than most people were aware of. In order to get us to where we need to be as a community, like this channel community, but also as a larger community as a whole, we need to decentralize sex in general, in relationships especially. The assumption is two people meet, they have an attraction to each other, usually that's understood as sexual attraction, and they find out if they're compatible in values, in sex, in expectations of relationship, politically, religiously. There are all these different ways that we understand whether or not we are compatible with someone before we call them our partner. And there are things that I would argue are core pieces of a relationship. Having similar values and priorities, to me, would be generally an important part of a relationship. It might not be to you. To you, having someone who shares your hobbies might be the most important thing. To someone else, someone who shares their need for independence might be the most important thing. Whatever it is that's that strong pillar in your relationship, somewhere in most relationships, the assumption is sex is also a pillar. But maybe it's not. Maybe that understanding is another piece of this patriarchal, compulsory life that we've all been living in. The normalizing of sexual interest in relation to other people, and really in relation to the feeling of desire itself, is generally used to regulate behavior. If you are disinterested in sex, the assumption is there's something wrong with you, and therefore we need to fix you to get you back in line with this understanding that we are all sexual creatures. But that understanding is not based on anything except for a social norm. The assumption that sex needs to be a central part of a relationship is literally just a social norm. If you're somebody who disagrees with this, I would invite you to ask yourself, how did you come to understand sex to be a central part of the relationship? I'm going to give you some responses I've gotten from people when I've had this conversation with them. One, they say, I enjoy it. What else do you enjoy? Are there other things that you enjoy a lot? Are they pivotal pieces of your relationship? Another one is the connection. I would really challenge that one, because for many people, there are 3 to 5 other things that can make them feel as intimately connected to you as a partner as having sex together does. If you're not sure what they are, ask your partner, because everybody says it is. Ding, ding, ding. That's what we're talking about. That's compulsory sexuality. To try to disentangle this is going to be a process. And I want to invite you on that process, but not to push you into any part of that process until you're ready. I do want to debunk these 3 pieces though. The first is that we're all born desiring subjects. There is not a discernible way when it comes to desire or pleasure or happiness to tell the difference in brain scans on how much people enjoy certain things and what it is that's provoking that enjoyment. I would submit that the understanding that we're all sexual creatures comes from purity culture. That comes from the Christian narrative that God made man and God made woman, made them for each other to procreate. Well, how do you procreate? You have to have sex. Then. Obviously, that's not true anymore. But then you had to have sex. And so the understanding that sex is the purpose for which people are created is so deep rooted and goes back so far. For people for whom sex is pleasurable, that makes sense. That's something that you can kind of get behind, is the understanding that we're made for this thing that is pleasurable and lovely to do together and also might create life in some instances. If sex was for pleasure, why are so many women in heterosexual relationships unsatisfied sexually? They're having sex, but they're not enjoying it. If the measure of enjoyment is an orgasm, which purity culture would tell us it is, they're not having those either, at least not the majority of the time. And still we keep this idea centralized that sex is like a significant thing in the relationship. Except that it's not, because of so many women in heterosexual relationships are not satisfied sexually or not interested sexually. How are we measuring this? Who is making that measurement? The idea that we all take up sexual identities, I think, is something that the queer community, especially early on, needs to take some responsibility in. In the effort to expand people's understanding of how people are or can be, we've used sex and sexual attraction as that measure. If a woman is a lesbian, the assumption is she's attracted to other women. Attraction. If a man is gay, the assumption is he is attracted to other men. Attraction. Myself being bisexual, I'm attracted to anyone, potentially. Still, it's attraction. So much of our identity in this community itself is still governed by sexual attraction. It's still understood under that label, and it is the focus of that identity, at least as far as we discern it from heterosexuality. I mean, how many of you have heard a straight person say,
I don't care what you do in the bedroom, just don't shove it in my face?
Well, that actually only applies if you're physically having sex in front of them. That's it. My attraction to my wife is not just about sex. But the assumption from the straight community is that our sexual attraction got twisted into something that doesn't look like theirs, and so this is who we are. That's just flat out not true. But then the gay, lesbian, pansexual, bisexual community puts that assumption on an asexual identity. We're all assuming our identity by who we're sexually attracted to. What does someone who's not sexually attracted to other people do about their identity? Like, where does that leave them? This is one, does it come from necessarily a negative place? Probably not. It's probably not on purpose for a lot of people. But the understanding that we are all taking up a sexual identity is harmful to the ace community for sure. It's also harmful to the goal of trying to decentralize what sex actually is and the part it plays in intimacy and connection and relationships in general. This other one is we all engage in sexual activity. Well, we all know that's not actually true, right? We're all very aware of that. There are so many reasons why people have sex, and there's so many reasons why people don't have sex. And it's individual to each person. So the assumption that all of us do anything when it comes to sexual activity is so narrow-minded. It's so small as far as the box that we're putting a person into. And we think it's big and we think it's expansive because we're saying sexual activity, whatever it looks like, if that looks like individual stimulation, if that looks like group sex, if that looks like having a partner, if that looks like having sex but not a partner, all of that is still rooted in the understanding that sexual activity is happening. Why are we assuming that? One of the super tragic understandings that came out of the 90s, early 2000s-ish era is the idea of lesbian bed death. And that is the assumption that two women, when they get together, eventually stop having sex. That assumption is grounded in heterosexuality in reality, because when a man and a woman get together and the couple stops having sex, it's generally assumed that it's because the woman loses interest, or because she's too busy to take care of the kids, or because there's too much going on. But it always is the fault of the woman in the heterosexual relationship. So if there's two women in a relationship, then obviously that happens because that happens in the other relationships. That's not true. First of all, statistically, that's completely untrue. Secondly, why would we ever buy that assumption as fact? And thirdly, that still centralizes sex as a major pillar of a relationship. Let me ask you this. If you have a hobby, say you like to crochet. No, maybe that's just me. If you have a hobby and your partner doesn't enjoy that hobby, will you break up with them for that? Will you stop being in a relationship with them? Usually the answer is no. Now, if the answer is yes, that's your right. That's how you roll. And you do deserve to have somebody who values things the same way that you do. In general, most people aren't breaking up with a partner because they don't share the same hobby interests. If you have a hobby and you'd like your partner to, try it out. Maybe they'll go and try it out of their own free will, consenting to trying it out. And if they don't enjoy it, they don't go back to that book club or group gathering or specific activity. They don't do it all of the time just because they know it makes you happy. Or if they choose to, they're choosing to. They're not expected to. Why is it different with sex? Why is the understanding that if we aren't having sex, we are not connecting? Why is that the default understanding? This goes back to the question I asked in the beginning. Do you know what non-sexual things makes you feel as connected to your partner as having sex does, or maybe even more? If you don't know what they are, or if you don't know what they are for your partner, that's a discussion that needs to happen. The pressure that sexual attraction, sexual chemistry, sexual desire puts on a relationship is disproportionate to the focus that we put on anything else in the relationship in reality. And we live in a world where compulsory sexuality is so ingrained that most people don't even know that this phrase is a thing. And it's very, very difficult to find actual peer-reviewed research on it. Like, that's how ingrained this is in the world, is there's not like the studies and stuff that are out there. There are limited studies on things like CompHet, gender expression, on all of those topics. There are even less when it comes to compulsory sexuality. It's just not a phrase that people are using a ton, even though it's been around definitely since 2015, definitely before that too. But the first like peer researched paper I was able to come across, the earliest one was 2015. When we live in a world that doesn't give us a choice to explore whether or not sex is even the primary means of connection with someone else, or if we, as a default want to connect with other people, which is an entirely different video. When we understand that to be the primary connection tool, we're leaving out the depth and the breadth of what a relationship can actually be. And the world that we live in devalues relationships that are not based on sex. So if you've got a best friend and you've got a spouse, the assumption as the world stands is that the spouse has a higher place in your priorities. And that's because you're having sex with them, presumptively. That doesn't make sense. None of that makes sense. Does this have many layers? Absolutely. Have I touched all of them? Obviously not. If you want to hear more about that, please comment below what your questions are, what your thoughts are, what this brings up for you. And I would love to do more videos in this series specifically. Also, if you want to learn more about asexuality, I do have this video right here I'd love for you to check out. It's about asexuality and purity culture and the connection between the two. That's it for today. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you all next time. And until then, take care of yourself and each other.